Okay, let's unpack this. I want you to close your eyes and just imagine a Wednesday morning. The sun comes up, birds are singing, the world is, well, it's still turning. But for you, this is the single most humiliating morning of your entire life.
It sounds dramatic, but humiliating is probably an understatement for the people we're talking about today. It was just devastating.
Right. Because you've sold your farm, you've closed up your shop, you said a tearful final goodbye to your neighbors, who, by the way, probably told you that you were losing your mind.
Oh, for sure.
You were absolutely 100% locked in on the idea that the world was ending yesterday, and yet, here we are. You're still here, the neighbors are staring, and you're broke.
That is the exact scenario for tens of thousands of people in the northeastern United States in October of 1844.
Today, we are doing a deep dive into a very specific slice of history. We're looking at the source material from the Church Heritage Manual, specifically Section 3. It covers this tight, volatile window of just 8 years, from 1844 to 1852.
And the manual calls this period the birth of the Remnant Church.
It really is a fascinating psychological and theological case study. We are looking at how a group of shattered believers, the Millerites, managed to pull themselves out of this moment of crushing defeat and organize into what would eventually become the Seventh-day Adventist movement.
And our mission here is to just walk through that transition step by step, strictly sticking to the history as it's laid out in the manual. We aren't here to take sides, just to report on how this group went from, chaos to structure.
So set the scene for us. This wasn't just a handful of people. Right?
No, not at all. The source material mentions that by the summer of 1844, something like 50,000 believers had actually separated from their original churches.
50,000.
Yeah. And this connects to what the manual describes as the second angel's message, this idea that Babylon is fallen.
That's pretty heavy terminology. For someone who doesn't speak 19th century theology, what were they actually saying?
In this context, Babylon basically meant the established churches Methodist, Baptist, you name it. These 50,000 people became, spiritual refugees. They left because their home churches had rejected the message of the Advent.
So they were all united by this one expectation. But here's where it gets really interesting. They had already been disappointed once, hadn't they?
Precisely. Originally, they thought something big was going to happen in the spring of 1844. When that didn't happen, there was this lull. They entered what they called the tarrying time, a waiting period.
A test of patience.
A huge test of patience. But then everything just ramped up again in August 1844 at a camp meeting in New Hampshire. And that's where we meet a man named Samuel S. Snow.
Okay, so what did Snow do?
Right. Snow presented what became known as the Midnight Cry. He essentially stood up and told them, "We've been calculating the date wrong." He looked at the 2300-day prophecy from the book of Daniel. The Millerites already knew that it ended in 1844, but Snow said they were using the wrong calendar.
He argued they needed to look at the Jewish calendar, right?
Correct. Specifically, the Karaite Jewish reckoning. Snow's logic was that the cleansing of the sanctuary, which they interpreted as Jesus returning to earth, had to happen on the Day of Atonement.
Which is
the 10th day of the 7th month in the Jewish system. And according to the Karaite calculation for that specific year, that date was October 22, 1844.
That is remarkably specific, October 22nd.
It had to be. Snow argued that God is an exact timekeeper. You don't get vague dates in prophecy. And this precision is what just reignited the fervor. I mean, the source describes the atmosphere as incredibly intense.
This is where that detail about the potatoes comes in.
Yes, I love that detail too. It's so human.
It is.
Farmers literally left their fields uncultivated. They didn't dig up their potatoes because they genuinely believed the harvest would be unnecessary. It was the ultimate burn the ships moment.
If you dig up your potatoes for the winter, you're admitting you might still be here.
Exactly. Leaving them to rot was a huge statement of faith.
So October 22, 1844 arrives. The Great Disappointment.
The manual describes it so vividly. Believers gathered in meeting houses and private homes. They sang hymns, they prayed, they waited, they watched the sunset, then they watched midnight pass.
And the morning of October 23rd must have just been brutal.
Oh, absolutely. The source mentions grief and weeping. The big question on everyone's lips was, have the scriptures failed? And for the vast majority, the answer was yes. They walked away.
So if the date was right, but the world didn't end, the event had to be wrong.
That's it. That's the pivot. And that realization, oddly enough, happens in a cornfield.
Which, honestly, sounds like the start of a movie scene. Walk us through it.
It really does. So it's the morning of October 23. You have a man named Hiram Edson. He and a friend are walking through a cornfield to go comfort some other believers, and suddenly Edson just stops dead in his tracks.
The manual says he seemed to see the heavenly sanctuary. What does that mean? Was this a hallucination?
The source frames it more as a flash of insight. He looked up and had this realization, this concept, that on October 22, Jesus hadn't come to earth. Instead, he had moved from the holy place to the most holy place in the heavenly sanctuary
To do what?
to begin a work of judgment. The manual calls it the investigative judgment, essentially a review of records before the final verdict.
I have to jump in because the dialogue in the source is great here. His friend, who had kept walking, turns around and yells something like, "Brother Edson, what are you stopping for?"
And Edson replies, "The Lord was answering our morning prayer." This was the turning point. This sanctuary doctrine solved the mystery. They concluded the time was right, but the event was in heaven, not on earth.
Okay, so that solves the when and the where. But then they start changing how they worship, specifically the day they worship. How do we get from Jesus is in the other room to we need to change our weekend?
It's a fascinating chain reaction. The source explains that studying the sanctuary led them to look closely at the Ark of the Covenant, which was in the most holy place, and inside the Ark.
The Ten Commandments.
Exactly. And if you're looking at the law of God in the heavenly temple, you can't really ignore the fourth commandment, the one that says the seventh day is the Sabbath.
But the leadership didn't come up with this, did they?
No, and that's a key point in the source. It started with a layperson, a woman named Rachel Oakes. She was a Seventh-day Baptist who was visiting her daughter in Washington, New Hampshire, and she brought some tracts, pamphlets about the Bible Sabbath.
I love that it starts with someone just handing out pamphlets. It really shows the grassroots nature of this whole thing.
It does. It spread from there. She challenged a minister named Frederick Wheeler, basically told him, "You're telling us to keep all the commandments, but you're breaking the fourth one yourself."
And he accepted it.
He did. Then a man named T.M. Preble wrote an essay on it in 1845.
And that essay falls into the hands of Joseph Bates. Now, Bates is a character we have to talk more about, but tell us the bridge story.
Oh, yes. So Joseph Bates reads Preble's article. He's convinced. He travels all the way to New Hampshire to verify it. Then he comes back home to Fairhaven, Massachusetts, and he's walking across a bridge and runs into a Mr. Hall.
And Mr. Hall makes the mistake of asking, "What's the news, Captain Bates?"
Exactly. And Bates, without missing a beat, replies, "The news is that the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord our God."
That is efficient evangelism.
It was. Apparently, Mr. Hall went home, read his Bible, and accepted it too. So by 1848, you have these scattered groups holding what the manual calls Sabbath conferences.
There were 6 of them that year.
Right. And this was all about unifying the platform. They were literally digging into scripture, arguing and studying until they hammered out a unified theology around the sanctuary and the Sabbath.
Okay, let's unpack the third pillar. The source calls this the gift of prophecy. This is where things get really distinctive.
It is. The manual points to a couple of verses in Revelation that they believed identified the Remnant Church as having the testimony of Jesus, which they defined as the spirit of prophecy, basically direct communication from God.
Now, usually when we hear about this, we hear about Ellen White. But the source lists 3 candidates. She wasn't the first choice.
That's right. And this is history that often gets overlooked. The first was William Ellis Foy. He was a black man, a freedman from Maine, and he received visions as early as 1842.
The source notes he was reluctant to share them.
Very reluctant. I mean, you have to consider the context. A black man in the 1840s claiming to speak for God, he faced significant risks and racial tensions. Then there was a second man, Hazen Foss, a talented young white man who received a vision about 3 platforms.
But he refused to share it.
He was afraid of ridicule. I mean, the Millerites were already a laughingstock. The source says the gift was withdrawn because he refused. And that leads to the third selection, a 17-year-old girl named Ellen Harmon.
Who we know as Ellen White.
Exactly. And she seems like such an unlikely choice. The source describes her as having really frail health.
There was that accident in her childhood, right?
Yeah, very tragic one. At age 9, she was hit in the face with a stone. It put her in a coma for 3 weeks and basically ended her formal education. She never really recovered her physical strength during those early years.
And yet she becomes this incredibly prolific writer.
Decades of writing, yeah. Her first vision was in December 1844, right after the disappointment. It depicted the Advent people traveling a narrow path to the holy city.
Now, obviously, claims of visions are going to be met with skepticism. How did the early believers validate this? They didn't just take her word for it.
No, they didn't. The manual lists 4 biblical tests that they applied. First, to the law and testimony, did her visions align with the Bible? Second, by their fruits, what was the outcome of her work? The source points to the schools and hospitals established later as evidence.
And predictions.
That's the third test. Predictions must come to pass. The source mentions a few, like the expansion of their publishing work, and some health insights, like identifying the nature of cancer as a virus. And the fourth test was confessing that Jesus came in the flesh.
There's also a mention of physical phenomena during the visions. This adds a very visual element to the story.
Yes, eyewitness accounts. The source describes her in vision not breathing, keeping her eyes open, and at one point holding an 18-pound family Bible on her outstretched arm for half an hour.
18 pounds. That's heavy. Literally.
From a purely physics standpoint, it's incredibly difficult, especially for a frail woman. For those present, it served as a sign that something supernatural was happening.
Okay, so we have the doctrines: sanctuary, Sabbath, spirit of prophecy. But a movement needs leaders. Let's do a roll call of the key pioneers. Who are the heavy hitters?
Well, you have to start with James White, Ellen's husband. He's described as a leader of men. He was the hustle behind the whole operation.
He sounds intense. The source mentions him mowing hay.
Yes, that's a great detail. He'd mow hay in the fields to earn a little money just so he could travel and preach. He was the organizer, the publisher, the preacher.
And then there's Joseph Bates, the sea captain we met on the bridge.
The fatherly figure. He was older, a former sea captain. He was a reformer, gave up alcohol and tobacco while at sea, and he poured his entire fortune into the movement. He was the one who really pushed the Sabbath doctrine early on.
And then the intellectual of the group, J.N. Andrews.
J.N. Andrews is impressive. He was only 15 during the Great Disappointment, but the source calls him the intellectual, a brilliant writer. He eventually mastered 7 languages and claimed to have memorized the New Testament.
7 languages. That's incredible.
He developed the theology of the Sabbath and later became the church's first official overseas missionary.
So you had the visionary, the organizer, the captain, and the scholar. It's quite a team.
It really is. They complemented each other's strengths almost perfectly.
We mentioned this earlier, but let's talk about how they got the word out.
Yeah.
This wasn't the age of the internet.
No, it was the age of the printing press, and publishing was central. It goes back to a vision Ellen White had in November 1848. She told her husband, James, that he needed to print a little paper.
The quote here is beautiful. She said it would be small at first, but
it would become like streams of light that went clear around the world.
So James White starts printing.
He does. In 1849, he publishes The Present Truth. The source notes he carried the first issues in a carpet bag to the post office.
A carpet bag. Humble beginnings.
Very. Then in 1850, they launched the Second Advent Review and Sabbath Herald. Today, that's known as the Adventist Review. And in 1852, they started the Youth's Instructor, the first magazine specifically for young people.
It's amazing to think of that progression, from a carpet bag to streams of light.
It shows the emphasis they placed on literacy and spreading their message. It solidified the movement. It gave those scattered believers something to hold on to, something that connected them all.
So looking at this 8-year window, 1844 to 1852, we start with total devastation and then a slow, methodical rebuilding.
It's a classic example of cognitive dissonance leading to, well, new discovery. They didn't abandon their faith. They redefined it. They moved from a scattered flock, as the source calls them, to a distinct entity.
This brings us to the title of the section, The Birth of the Remnant Church. What does the source actually mean by remnant? The imagery is quite specific.
This is a really interesting analogy from the manual. It says that the remnant is like the last piece of a bolt of cloth.
A bolt of cloth.
Yes. Imagine a roll of fabric. The idea is that the remnant piece, the very end of the roll, is identical in fabric and pattern to the very first piece cut from it.
So they saw themselves as being identical to the original apostolic church.
That's the idea. They weren't trying to invent a new religion. They believed they were restoring the original pattern that had been lost over time.
It's fascinating how a moment of such public failure didn't end the movement. If anything, it seems like the pressure of that failure is exactly what forged these doctrines.
Absolutely. If Christ had returned in 1844, none of this theology, the sanctuary, the Sabbath, the publishing work would have developed in this way. The tarrying time became the working time.
And that cornfield became ground zero for a global denomination. It really raises an important question, doesn't it? When your expectations are completely shattered, do you walk away? Or do you look for a new perspective that reshapes your reality?
That's where it gets really interesting. It's about resilience and the search for meaning when the map you were following just runs right off the edge of the page.
Well said. That wraps up our deep dive into Section 3 of the Church Heritage Manual. From potatoes left in the ground to streams of light around the world.
It's quite a journey.
Thanks for joining us. Catch you on the next deep dive.